In 1969, Miss Betty Penrose filed a petition in Arizona court against God, seeking $100,000 in damages for negligence. The defendant was accused of allowing a lightning bolt to strike her house and set it ablaze. Miss Penrose's lawyer filed the petition in Sonoma County, California, although she was from Arizona, because God had a local address in Sonoma County. As it happened, folk singer Lou Gottlieb of the Limelighters had just transferred the deed of his Sonoma County hippie commune ranch, Morningstar Farms, to God's name in order to protest private property and ownership. So Miss Penrose's lawyer figured if he filed the case there, he might win by default when God was served at God's home address, but then most likely failed to show up in court. Unfortunately for Miss Penrose and her lawyer, the deed for the farm was invalidated when God did not appear to take up residence, and the case was ultimately dismissed. Now, from one angle, this story amuses as a lighthearted attempt to take advantage of the legal system. But from another, it reminds us of this very real situation that comes along again and again in human relationship with the divine. When evil happens, it is so fundamentally human to take God to court for it, so to speak. Is God responsible for lightning bolts and famines and deadly earthquakes and political mayhem and terminal cancer, mental illness? Why do these things happen, and how will they end? We want God to explain God's self in court. We want to know, is God among us or not? In our scripture lesson today, the Hebrew people are described as doing almost the same thing that Miss Penrose did, making a judiciary complaint against God. This one is not lighthearted. This one is life and death. The people are right smack in the middle of the wilderness when they find that there is no water. And we all know you can't go long without water, especially not in the heat of the desert. So the people come to Moses to quarrel. And the word translated again and again, quarrel, in this passage, is also used throughout the Old Testament to describe legal complaints and cases. The people are putting Moses and God to trial. They'd followed Moses and God's leading into the wilderness in hopes of a better life, and they're starting to wonder when that better life will transpire. Or if they can't find water soon, perhaps there won't be a life for them at all. Now, if you went to Sunday school as a child or even as an adult, you may have heard the Hebrew people get a pretty bad rap for all of their complaining. After all, God has brought them out of slavery in Egypt and continues to provide for their needs day after day. Manna, bread raining down from heaven, a pillar of cloud and fire to guide them like a precursor to the GPS. Every day, God showing up, and yet they still get anxious and testy. And certainly as this particular story was passed down in the biblical tradition, it was passed down along with a sense of judgment on the people for asking God to prove God's presence with a miracle and then another miracle. Do not put the Lord your God to the test as you tested him at Massah, the Hebrew people are told later in their wilderness journey in the book of Deuteronomy. And this remembrance makes its way into a psalm as well, where the psalmist writes, "Do not harden your hearts as you did at Meribah, as you did that day at Massah in the wilderness." Even Jesus will take up this injunction and quote it in his own wilderness journey, spending 40 days in the desert and refusing to ask God to prove God's presence via a miraculous sign. "It is written," Jesus says, "do not put the Lord your God to the test." But on the other hand, despite these negative depictions of the story as they were passed down, if you actually read this passage in the Bible on its own, God really doesn't seem put off by the question. God knows that the people have real, even desperate need. They are thirsty and they are scared, and they are longing for a reminder of the presence of God with them on this journey. Moses may feel a little bit what our Sunday school teachers felt, exasperation with the people, but God does not chastise them. God assures them that they are not abandoned in the wilderness. God provides the water. Now, the wilderness in Scripture is a middle place, a place in between promise and fulfillment. The people of Israel have left Egypt on a promise, but for 40 years they will roam this middle place before the promise is fulfilled. 40 years of parched landscapes, of danger of attack, of not knowing where the next meal will come from. 40 years waiting, second-guessing, wondering if God is really there, even in the wilderness. Is God among us or not? And if the wilderness is the middle place before the answer is clear, before the promise or hope fully arrives, then I suppose many of us spend much of our lives in the wilderness. We leave a career or a relationship or a situation on a hunch that God has something else for us. And then we wander for so long in search of whatever is next. Or we leave a doctor's appointment with a whole slew of words and drugs to Google and research, and what follows are months, or maybe even years, of more and more layers of questions instead of answers. Or we've just spent so long in the midst of a life that all feels like wandering that we don't even remember what it was we were hoping for. Now, I suspect that some of you today may feel like you're currently in a wilderness. And if you are, I hope you'll know that you are in good company. There are so many wilderness stories in our lives and also in our scriptures. You might even consider reading some later and asking what they might say to you. There's the one where Hagar flees Sarah and Abraham and runs in desperation into the desert. And what she finds there is a vision of God. There's one where Jacob heads out alone into the wilderness one night and wrestles with God in the darkness. There's one where Jesus endures 40 days of temptation in the desert and at the end is attended by angels. And it seems, according to the Bible, that while the wilderness can seem to be such a God-forsaken place, it actually is not. It actually is a holy place, a place where God is present, inviting us into deeper trust and relationship. I guess sometimes that response of God looks like providing the material, direct answer. The Hebrew people got their water from a rock. And many of you have a wilderness story like that. You were not sure where the next turn was, and God met you there. It could have been in the form of a knock at your door with flowers, or an out-of-nowhere phone call with a new opportunity, or just a friend to sit there staring at whatever country you had left behind. But sometimes God's answer in the wilderness is not direct. Sometimes it is much harder to read or even doesn't seem to exist at all. And I don't know why there are so many people who cry out for water from rocks, for healing from chronic pain, for recovery from addiction for their relative, for reconciliation in relationships, and don't see the answer they're hoping for. I don't know why the wilderness journey seems so long for some people. But I notice that many of the Bible's wilderness stories don't exactly solve the problems the way this one does. Hagar and Jacob both journeyed into the desert and both met angelic beings who blessed them, but the next day, their down-to-earth fears and troubles were still just as much there. In those cases, maybe what makes the wilderness a holy place is not a God who can do magic tricks, but a God who is just there among us. That's God's greatest gift, after all, isn't it? Jesus, who is also called Emmanuel, God with us, is the ultimate expression of God's commitment to be with us and love us in the middle of whatever journey or wilderness place we find ourselves. And maybe you have that kind of wilderness story of your own, too. Author Sarah Bessey, whose forthcoming book will be entitled Field Notes from the Wilderness, writes of a time when she and her husband were in that middle place, driving away from Texas, where they had lived for many years, where they were leaving ministry, burnt out and hurt, where they'd suffered yet another miscarriage, where, as a Canadian by birth, Sarah was always just so dang hot. And the whole drive through the desert back to Canada, Sarah was venting about the question, is God among us or not? She vented to her husband all the way across Texas and through New Mexico and up into Arizona. And as they got out of the car in Arizona for a lunch stop, she complained again about the heat and about the fact that she didn't know who she was anymore. She didn't know who God was anymore. I feel like my whole life is a barren desert right now, she said. And then they sat down at a picnic table behind a gas station to eat their sandwiches. And they heard something. Is that water? In the middle of the desert in Arizona, they followed the sound down a red sandy hill to a babbling creek behind the gas station. And without thinking, Sarah remembered just walking straight in and splashing water all over herself, a reprieve from the constant state of being overheated, and perhaps, more importantly, a quiet song calling her back to trust in God. Literal water in the desert, isn't that a little too on the nose, she said to her husband. But maybe the wilderness wasn't God-forsaken. Maybe God was there inviting her to listen to those quiet sounds and investigate, to enter a new and deeper level of trust. The ways she'd been hurt by people and churches and grief for her miscarriage had not changed. She'd just found the way in the wilderness can still be paved with holiness, with God's presence. Ultimately, I guess what most of us are really looking for in our own wilderness journeys isn't really $100,000 in damages from God. We don't really want to put God to the test, insist God prove God's self with miraculous interventions. I mean, there are definite situations where that kind of God would be handy, even welcome. Don't get me wrong. But even then, even more than a God who sometimes shows up with a miracle, I want a God who is always, always there. Is God among us or not? So why does all this matter? How are we supposed to respond to this story? I suspect that these many wilderness journeys and stories are recorded, and they're stories that we tell each other as well, because asking that question, is God among us or not, is one of the most important questions we can ask as humans. At the end of seminary, I was with two of my closest friends, reflecting on our experience and all the unknowns of ministry ahead. And I confessed to them that sometimes, even with all I've committed to God, even with all that I'd received and all the love that I'd been surrounded by, even with all that I'd learned, sometimes I still didn't know if I believed the whole thing. One of my friends immediately had something to say. I think it's good to ask, she said. Doubt is part of faith. I nodded. Yeah, I'd heard that before. When you doubt, you can seek answers that will make your faith stronger. You can sort out what's really true and find firmer ground with God. You can find doubt to be healthy. It can be part of your journey. That answer was fine, but perhaps it didn't seem equal to the life that we were about to embark on. What if we left this place and asked those questions and didn't find water from a rock? What if there wasn't enough water in the deserts of life ahead? We were in between this promise of a life of meaning and ministry and the fulfillment of it, the experience of it. We were somewhere in the middle in this wilderness. And if we were going to keep going, following where we thought God was leading, we needed to know God was there. But my friend spoke again. No, I don't mean it that way, she said. I don't mean that doubt can make faith stronger if you ask the right questions and find the right answers. I mean that doubt itself is part of a strong faith. If we are even willing to ask the questions, it means there is a faith there to question. If we are able to lodge complaints at God, it means there is a God listening and responding to our complaints. And maybe she's right. Maybe it is that closely connected, that simple in a way, that the complaints and questions in the wilderness are a part of rather than a detour from our path of faith. I've learned as a parent that young children save their most anguished screams and punches and mean retorts for the relationships they trust the most. Even Jesus seemed to validate all of her questioning when he called out from the cross, "God, why have you forsaken me?" And maybe that gives us all our assignment from this week's reading, to ask the question of the Hebrew people, to not be afraid to speak in the moments that we wake up in the night and wonder where the water will come from tomorrow, to listen to the voice within us during the long wilderness journeys of health or career or marriage or friendship, where day after day there's this whisper inside us that we sometimes try to drown out, saying, "Is God among us or not?" To ask that question as the people of Israel asked near the start of their journey into the desert on the cusp of a way into a whole new life. To ask that question as Jesus asked from the cross on the cusp of his journey through death and into resurrection, is to reaffirm the strength of our relationship with God. To ask is to say, here I am in the middle of a parched wilderness, but I am looking for something holy. To ask is at the same time to affirm that we trust. Thanks be to God.